What if the most important battle happening in Iran right now is not the one you keep seeing on the news? A top commander is dead. Fighters are moving through the mountains in a pattern that took decades to build, and the regime is telling everyone to stop asking questions. Before we go further, if you want to actually understand what is happening inside Iran right now, and not just the version being repeated everywhere else, hit that like button so this reaches more people, subscribe if you are new here, and send this to one person who still thinks this is just a story about missiles and ships. Now, let's get into it. On July 11th, 2026, the senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard died on a highway in the southeast of the country. His car flipped. The government opened an investigation and asked the public not to speculate. That alone might sound like a routine tragedy. But on that exact same day, in a completely different part of Iran, something else happened. Armed fighters struck Revolutionary Guard positions in 4 separate locations at once. These were not close together. They were spread across 200 kilometers of mountain terrain in the west of the country. 4 fights, 4 confirmed casualties among Iran's security forces. One day, 2 unrelated events on paper. But when you place them side by side, they stop looking like coincidence and start looking like a pattern. And once you understand who is behind the second event, and why the timing lines up so precisely with everything else happening in Iran right now, you start to see a much bigger picture than the one being shown to most people watching this conflict from the outside. Most of the attention on Iran right now is focused on the Strait of Hormuz, American airstrikes, Iranian missiles, warships sunk, radar stations destroyed, weeks of open combat in the Persian Gulf. That story is real, and it matters. But it is only the part of the war you can see from a satellite. Underneath it, there's a second war, quieter, slower, and in some ways far more dangerous to the regime than anything happening at sea. This is the war in the mountains, and almost nobody is talking about it. Let's start with the man who died on that highway. His name was Mohammad Azerbata. He was not some low-level official. He was the political deputy of the Revolutionary Guard's Navy, its public face. For months, he had stood in front of cameras threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes on the planet. The European Union had sanctioned him personally for his role in that campaign. He was close with the top commanders running Iran's naval forces. In other words, this was not a random passenger on a mountain road. This was one of the men responsible for Iran's entire strategy of using the strait as leverage against the world. Then his car overturned. Iran's own state media, run by the Revolutionary Guard itself, reported the story. Police responded. He was taken to a hospital where he died from his injuries. And almost immediately, Iranian officials asked everyone to wait for the investigation and not jump to conclusions. Here's the problem with that request. Anyone who has studied how Iran's government behaves knows this pattern well. When someone important dies in a way the regime cannot publicly blame on an enemy without being forced to respond, the official story is almost always an accident, a car crash, a heart attack, a sudden illness. This has happened enough times to enough senior officials that it has become its own recognizable pattern. The regime does not admit when someone has been taken out, because admitting it means they would have to do something about it. And right now, in the middle of high-stakes negotiations, with a war already stretching them thin, doing something about it is the last thing they can afford. So the official story stays simple. A road, a crash, an investigation that will probably never produce a public conclusion, and the world is asked to move on. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the timing of his death overlaps almost exactly with those 4 coordinated attacks in the mountains. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand who has been living in those mountains for a very long time. The people carrying out these attacks are Kurdish fighters. Kurds make up roughly 1 in every 10 people in Iran. They have lived along the western border of the country for hundreds of years, and they have been in conflict with the Islamic Republic since the very beginning. In 1979, in the earliest months after the revolution, Iran's founding leader effectively declared war on the Kurdish population, calling for military action against them. That is not ancient history to the people living there. It shaped how an entire generation of Kurdish families grew up, and it explains why resistance to the regime never fully disappeared, even during the quietest years. But here is what makes 2026 different from every previous decade of this conflict. For most of the last 40 years, Kurdish resistance inside Iran has been divided. Different groups, different leaders, different strategies, sometimes even working against each other instead of together. That kind of division is exactly what a regime like Iran's wants, because a fractured opposition is an opposition that can be managed, contained, and picked apart one piece at a time. That changed a few months before this war even started. In February of this year, 5 major Kurdish political parties inside Iran formally merged their efforts, forming a single coalition with one clear goal: bring down the regime and secure real self-governance for Kurdish people inside Iran. For the first time in modern history, these groups agreed to fight under something resembling a shared command. That is not a minor development. That is the difference between scattered resistance and an organized movement. Inside that coalition are groups with very different backgrounds, but real combat experience. Some fighters trained alongside international forces during the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, which means they understand modern coordinated warfare, not just mountain ambush tactics passed down from previous generations. One of the oldest parties in the coalition has been active since the 1940s, giving the alliance decades of political credibility inside Iran and internationally. Another group had already been striking Revolutionary Guard positions before this war officially began, meaning they were not waiting for permission from anyone. They were already engaged. Altogether, the coalition is estimated to have around 2,500 fighters operating out of bases near the Iran-Iraq border, with routes into Iranian territory that they have used for years. 2,500 people who know every ridge, every pass, every checkpoint across that stretch of mountains, because many of them grew up there. That last point matters more than it sounds. This is not a foreign force parachuting into unfamiliar territory. These are people who learned this landscape as children, who know which paths flood in spring and which ridgelines offer cover at sunset, knowledge that no amount of satellite imagery can fully replace. An outside army can study a map. These fighters lived the map. And that kind of generational familiarity with terrain is exactly the advantage that lets a smaller force punch far above its numbers when the fight moves from open ground into mountains and valleys. Now, on paper, 2,500 fighters sounds small compared to the full military strength of the Iranian state. And for most of history, that gap would have mattered enormously. Light infantry with rifles and rocket launchers can win an ambush, but they eventually lose a sustained fight against tanks, helicopters, and artillery. That has always been the ceiling on what Kurdish resistance could accomplish. You could hurt the regime. You could not outfight it in open terrain. That ceiling has quietly disappeared. Small first-person view drones, the same cheap flying weapons that reshaped modern battlefields elsewhere in the world, have spread across the Middle East. A unit hiding in mountain terrain with these drones does not need an air force anymore. It does not need heavy weapons. It needs eyes in the sky and a $500 drone that can find and strike a vehicle before it ever reaches the fight. Mountains create natural bottlenecks. Fighters who grew up in those mountains already knew where those bottlenecks were. Now they can see everything moving toward them before it arrives, and they can hit it before it gets close. This flips the entire equation. The Revolutionary Guard's advantage in armor and firepower stops mattering as much when the terrain itself becomes the enemy's biggest weapon, and cheap drones remove the cost of fighting back. A regime that used to be able to overwhelm resistance fighters with sheer military weight now has to think twice about sending armored convoys into terrain where a single operator with a laptop and a drone can turn a tank into scrap metal. If you're starting to see how all these pieces connect, you're not alone. And there's more worth understanding before we get to where this is really heading. If this is opening your eyes to something you were not seeing before, do something small right now. Drop a comment with one word, just so I know you're still with me, because what comes next explains why this Kurdish coalition suddenly has capabilities it never had before, and who might be helping make that possible. Here is the uncomfortable question nobody in official channels wants to answer directly. How does a coalition like this suddenly show up with coordinated attacks? How does a group that unified only 6 days before a major military operation begin execute same-day attacks across 200 kilometers of terrain? That kind of synchronization does not happen by accident. It requires planning, communication, and logistics that go beyond what a self-funded group of mountain fighters typically has access to. The public record on outside support is messy, but it is not empty. There were public statements from American leadership suggesting support for Kurdish action against the regime. There were reports describing plans for Kurdish forces to move into Iranian border areas with backing from allies in the region. There is also documented evidence that the earlier wave of airstrikes against Iranian targets specifically weakened command centers, air defenses, and supply routes along the western border. This was the exact area where Kurdish forces operate. Whether or not that was intentional, it created space for exactly this kind of activity to expand. Then, Turkey stepped in. Turkey has long designated one of the groups tied to this coalition as a terrorist organization. Reports suggest that Turkish leadership personally pushed to shut down any formal plan to arm this coalition, regardless of how useful it might be against Iran. According to regional reporting, that pressure worked, at least officially. The formal plan was reportedly scrapped. And yet, the attacks are still happening. The coordination is still visible. The specific locations being hit match almost exactly what earlier planning had identified. This identified the ideal zone for exactly this kind of campaign. So either something was never fully shut down, or something has quietly started again through hidden channels. Either way, the operational result is the same. Fighters who were divided for decades are now acting together, hitting multiple targets on the same day. They are hitting in terrain that gives them the advantage, at the exact moment the regime is least prepared to absorb it. There is another detail worth slowing down on. because it explains why this new wave of coordination feels so different from anything that came before it. For decades, the biggest obstacle facing Kurdish resistance inside Iran was never courage or determination. It was firepower. You can raise a generation of fighters willing to risk everything for a cause. But if the opposing side has helicopters, artillery, and armored columns, the math catches up. If you have rifles and homemade explosives against helicopters and tanks, the math eventually catches up with you. Entire uprisings in the 20th century were crushed, not because the people fighting them lacked resolve, but because the regime could always bring more steel to the fight. The regime could always bring more steel than the mountains could absorb. That imbalance shaped the strategy of every Kurdish movement that came before this one. Hit hard, hit fast, disappear back into the terrain before the regime can respond with full force. It was survival through hit and run, never through direct confrontation. What has changed now is not the will to fight. It is the cost of fighting back. A drone that fits in a backpack and costs less than a used motorcycle can now do what used to require an entire squadron of trained pilots. It can do what used to require millions of dollars in equipment. That is not a small shift. That is a rewrite of capabilities. That is a rewrite of what a small, motivated group of fighters is capable of achieving against a state military. And when you combine that shift with a coalition that, for the first time in its history, is actually coordinating instead of competing, you get exactly the kind of operation that unfolded. Not a lucky ambush, a demonstration. And this is where the death of that naval commander stops looking like an isolated event and starts looking like one thread in a much bigger picture. Because at the same time all of this is happening in the mountains, something else is happening inside Iran's largest cities. In late June, resistance groups operating inside cities like Tehran and Isfahan launched a coordinated campaign of their own. Not armed attacks, but public messaging. Posters, graffiti, materials calling openly for regime change, placed in public view, timed deliberately to coincide with a major gathering of Iranian opposition leaders. At that gathering, opposition figures described the current period as the closing chapter for the regime, pointing specifically to uncertainty around the country's new supreme leader. They pointed to this as a moment of real vulnerability. Think about what that means when you put it next to everything else. Armed resistance in the mountains, political resistance in the cities, a senior military figure dead under suspicious circumstances, and a leadership transition at the very top of the regime that has produced no public appearance, no proof that the new supreme leader is actually functioning. This is not one crisis. It is several crises overlapping at the same time, each one making the others harder to manage. To understand why the overlap is so dangerous for the regime specifically, you need to understand how Iran's Revolutionary Guard is actually built to operate under pressure. It was designed around a strategy of deliberate decentralization. Instead of one command structure controlling everything from the top, the organization is broken into smaller units. These units can keep operating even if leadership above them is disrupted. Each unit carries out its assigned orders independently. The idea is that you cannot cut off the head of this organization, because it was never built to depend entirely on the head. In normal conditions, that structure makes the organization incredibly resilient. You can damage one part without collapsing the whole. But look at the conditions right now. A supreme leader who has not appeared in public, a senior naval commander dead on a highway, coordinated attacks happening in the mountains, organized resistance messaging in the cities, air defenses that have already been degraded by weeks of strikes. Under this specific combination of pressure, that same decentralized structure becomes a liability instead of a strength. Units that are cut off from clear central direction do not automatically stand down. They keep following whatever order they were last given. There is nobody left in a position to update it. That is not a comforting thought when some of those units have access to serious weapon systems. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, because it requires understanding several moving pieces at once instead of just watching missile footage, but it may end up mattering more than anything happening in the Persian Gulf. Now let's put honest numbers on the resistance itself, without exaggerating. 2,500 fighters, even with drones and coordinated planning, cannot march into the capital and take control of the country. That is not realistic, and nobody serious is claiming it is. What they can do is force the regime to spend attention, manpower, and resources. They force the regime to fight an internal battle at the exact moment it is also trying to manage an external war and hold together fragile negotiations. They also have to figure out who is actually in charge at the top. None of those pressures alone would be enough to threaten the regime. It is the fact that they are all happening at the same time, on a command structure that is already showing cracks that changes the picture. One fire is manageable. Several fires burning across the country at once with no clear leadership coordinating the response is a different kind of problem entirely. There is also a ticking clock running underneath all of this that most coverage completely ignores. In the middle of June, Iran signed an agreement. Iran signed an agreement with the United States, opening a 60-day window for negotiations. The terms on the table were significant. Iran would stop enriching uranium, destroy existing stockpiles, limit its missile program, and agree to new terms around the Strait of Hormuz. In return, it would get relief from sanctions that have crushed its economy for years, access to frozen funds, and the ability to sell oil again. For a government whose economy has been strangled for years, that deal is not a small offer. It could be the difference between staying functional and running out of money. As of the events described here, roughly 3 weeks of that 60-day window had already passed. And in those 3 weeks alone, the new leadership had not appeared publicly, and Kurdish fighters had launched coordinated attacks across multiple provinces. Resistance messaging had spread through major cities, and a senior commander had died in what officials called an accident. That is not a quiet 3 weeks. That is a government trying to negotiate its way out of an economic crisis, while its internal control appears to be slipping in real time. Here's the part worth sitting with for a moment. The entire foundation of Iran's negotiating power rests on one thing: the Strait of Hormuz. For years, the regime built its strategy around this single idea, that no matter how much pressure outside powers applied, Iran could threaten global oil supply. They believed they could force the world back to the table on their own terms. That strategy only works if the regime can actually maintain control at home. It only works if the population accepts the cost of ongoing conflict, if the military keeps functioning as one coordinated force, and if no serious internal alternative starts gaining credibility. Every single one of those conditions is now under strain at the same time. That is not speculation. That is what the mountains and cities are showing. Think about what leverage actually means in a negotiation like this. It is not just about having a weapon. It is about everyone believing you are willing and able to use it. It is about using it consistently without your own house falling apart while you do it. For years, that belief held. The world assumed Iran's internal control was solid enough that the threat to the strait was credible no matter what else was happening. That assumption is exactly what is being tested right now, in real time, by fighters in the mountains and organizers in the cities. These people have nothing to do with the negotiations in Doha, but everything to do with whether those negotiations mean anything at all. A threat only works as long as the hand holding it is steady. Right now, that hand is being pushed from 3 different directions at once, and everyone at that negotiating table knows it, even if nobody says it out loud. If you have made it this far, you already understand more about what is really happening in Iran than most headlines are giving people credit for. That kind of understanding is worth holding on to. So if this has been genuinely useful, take 3 seconds and tap that like button before you keep watching. It tells me to keep making videos that go past the surface instead of repeating the same clips everyone else is using. And if you know someone who still thinks this war is only about missiles over water, this is the video to send them. So where does this actually go from here? Nobody can say for certain, but the pattern is not subtle anymore. Every attack in the mountains, every poster hung in a city square, every unexplained death of a senior official chips away at the same foundation. It chips away at the foundation the regime is relying on to survive its negotiations. The people negotiating in Doha are not separated from what is happening back home. They are racing against it. Every day that passes with more instability inside Iran is a day where their ability to guarantee anything becomes less believable. It becomes less believable to everyone sitting across from them. The regime can keep calling these fighters terrorists. It can keep opening investigations that never produce public answers. It can keep asking its own citizens and the rest of the world not to speculate. But none of that changes what is actually happening on the ground. The mountains are still active. The coalition is still coordinated. The cities are still producing resistance messaging. Time to embarrass the government on the international stage. And the clock on that negotiation window keeps running, whether or not the regime is ready for what happens when it runs out. What we are watching right now might not be one dramatic moment that changes everything overnight. It might be something slower and, in its own way, more dangerous for the people trying to hold power in Tehran. A regime that built its entire survival strategy around controlling a narrow strip of water is now discovering that the ground underneath it was never as stable as assumed. And once cracks like this start showing in multiple places at the same time, history has shown again and again that they rarely close back up. That is the story most people are not seeing right now because it is happening in mountain passes and city alleyways instead of on open water. But it may end up being the story that decides how this entire conflict actually ends. Wars are usually remembered for their loudest moments: the missile strikes, the sunk ships, the burning oil terminals that fill up news broadcasts. But regimes rarely fall because of one loud moment. They fall because of 100 quiet ones happening at the same time. Each one is small enough to explain away on its own until the day comes when there are simply too many of them to explain away at once. A commander dead on a highway, a poster on a wall in Tehran, a drone crossing a ridgeline. Nobody was watching closely enough. None of these alone topples a government that has survived for over 4 decades. But stack enough of them on top of each other, on a command structure already stretched thin, and you get something far more dangerous than any single battle. You get a foundation that no longer holds the weight it was built to carry. Keep watching this space, because whatever happens next in Iran will not start with a headline. It will start exactly like this did, quietly, in a place nobody was fully paying attention to, until suddenly everyone is.